All right, welcome back for another deep dive. We're really excited about this one. We always try to bring you those thinkers that maybe you haven't heard as much about, or some interesting conflicts and clashes that really get to the heart of some of those big philosophical questions. And today we're going to be talking about Descartes, but more specifically, someone who initially was a real fan of Descartes, a follower, and ended up breaking with him in a very public and dramatic way.
Yeah. So we're going to be talking about Henricus Regius. And he's someone who you might have come across if you've read any Descartes as one of his correspondents. But he wrote this really interesting book in 1646 called Fundamenta Physicis, which translates to the Foundations of Physics. And he offers a very compelling but also quite different perspective on some of these key questions that Descartes was also wrestling with.
So right from the start, we have someone who's not just in the shadow of Descartes, but trying to work out his own philosophical system.
Yes.
So, okay, so we've got Regius, we've got Descartes, and there's this kind of initial period where, like, their thought is developing kind of in parallel, it seems like. But then there's this big break, and it involves not just Descartes, but also a theologian named Gisbertus Voetius.
Right. And so Voetius is this very prominent theologian, a Calvinist theologian at the University of Utrecht. And he becomes a kind of central figure in this controversy.
And what's interesting, too, is this isn't just like a minor disagreement. They're arguing about some pretty fundamental things, like how do we know things? What's the nature of a human being? What's the relationship between philosophy and theology? I mean, all big questions.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, these were the hot-button issues of the 17th century.
Yeah.
And to see them play out in this very public way, I think it gives us a lot of insight into just how dynamic that intellectual landscape really was.
Okay, so for all of you listening, for our philosophically minded audience, we want you to really think with us about Regius. Where does he agree with Descartes? Where does he disagree? Why does it matter, not just historically, but even for how we think about philosophy today? So we're going to be looking at his epistemology.
How we know what we know.
Right, and also his view of human nature. And I think there's going to be some surprising stuff in there for you. So to really understand Regius, maybe we should just start with a little bit of his background. Where does this guy come from?
So Regius was born in 1598 in Utrecht in the Netherlands.
Okay.
And he comes from a fairly wealthy family, a brewing family, so there was some money there. But he had very broad intellectual interests. He starts out actually studying the arts, but then he turns to medicine, studies in Groningen, Leiden, Montpellier, and finally gets his MD from Padua in 1623.
So quite a foundation of learning, a very well-traveled and well-educated guy.
Right. Very much a kind of cosmopolitan figure.
Okay, so he's got his MD. What happens next?
So he returns to Utrecht, where he was born.
Okay.
And he becomes the town physician.
Makes sense.
But he also, interestingly enough, spends some time as a headmaster in Naarden, which is another town in the Netherlands. And apparently during this time, he faced some challenges, some pushback for his Calvinist views. Now, this is important because Regius, throughout his life, remains a committed Calvinist.
Okay, so he's got the medical background, he's got this religious commitment, and then he ends up back in Utrecht. And
Right.
I think this is where things get interesting.
Yeah, so in 1636, the illustrious school in Utrecht is transformed and elevated into a university.
Okay.
And Regius is appointed to the faculty. Now, initially, he's appointed as an extraordinary professor.
So not a full professor right away.
Right, not a full professor right away. And his main areas are theoretical medicine and botany. But what's really interesting is that his contract is actually extended to include the expectation that he'll also lecture on natural philosophy.
Oh, this is where we might see some of those disciplinary tensions start to emerge.
Right. Because you already had established chairs in philosophy, in mathematics, and in theology.
Yeah. So he's coming in and kind of maybe shaking things up a little bit.
Exactly.
But he's also, around this time, becoming increasingly interested in Descartes, right?
Oh, yes. So around 1638, through a mutual acquaintance, Henricus Reneri, Regius comes to the attention of Descartes. And they begin a correspondence that lasts for about 7 years.
Okay.
And it's very clear from the letters that Regius is very enthusiastic about Descartes' philosophy. In fact, he starts to teach it privately to his students.
So he's really promoting this new way of thinking.
He is. And he even had plans to produce his own kind of summary of natural philosophy based on Cartesian principles. And these plans seem to have gotten a real boost when Regius had the opportunity to read Descartes' unpublished work, Le Monde, around 1641.
The world.
The world, yeah. And so one thing that's very clear, both in Descartes' thinking and in Regius's early thinking, is that they both rejected the traditional Aristotelian framework that dominated the universities at the time.
Yeah, all those forms and qualities and things like that.
Right. They saw that as not really being explanatory.
Okay, so we've got this kind of period of intellectual harmony, it seems like. But then things get really messy.
Yeah.
So tell us about this dispute with Voetius. What happens there?
Right. So in November 1641, Regius begins a series of public disputations.
Mm.
These were kind of formal academic events where you would debate philosophical theses.
Right.
And these disputations were titled De Illustribus Aliquet Questionibus Physiologicus.
Catchy.
Yeah. So basically on some illustrious physiological questions. And what Regius was doing in these disputations was directly challenging a lot of the central Aristotelian doctrines that were taught by his colleagues in philosophy and also significantly in theology.
Oh, this is where Voetius comes in.
Exactly. So Voetius, as professor of theology and as a rector of the university at that time, was very committed to a particular view of Calvinist theology that relied heavily on Aristotelian metaphysics.
Right, so he's seeing this as a threat to his whole theological system.
Exactly. And he sees Regius's challenges as a direct attack on the foundations of that system.
And is there a particular philosophical claim that really sparks the controversy?
Yeah, the real flashpoint seems to have been a thesis that was defended by one of Regius's students, Henricus van Loon, in December 1641.
Okay.
And this thesis argued that the human mind and body are two distinct substances, but that they're joined together accidentally.
Accidentally.
Yeah, so unum per accidens was the term they used.
Okay, so not essentially related.
Right, not essentially related. And this was really a kind of problematic claim from the perspective of Christian philosophy at the time.
Why?
Because it raised all sorts of questions about traditional doctrines, like the immortality of the soul. If the soul is only accidentally joined to the body, how can it survive the death of the body? How could it exist independently?
Right, right. So this has implications for things like the resurrection of the body, too, except
Right here.
huge theological implications.
Yeah, absolutely. So Voetius, along with his colleagues in the theology faculty, they react very strongly to this.
They're not happy.
Not happy at all.
So what do?
So in December 1641, Voetius appends a series of corollaries to his own theological disputations.
Okay.
And these corollaries are basically a direct response to Regius. And in these corollaries, Voetius accuses the new philosophy, which is clearly a reference to Cartesianism, of all sorts of errors.
Like what?
Well, he says it leads to the view that human beings are just accidental unities. He accuses it of endorsing Copernicanism, which was, still a bit controversial at the time. And he claims that it promotes skepticism and irreligion because it denies the existence of substantial forms.
Right, so he's basically saying this is bad news for religion.
Exactly. And what's really important for our story is that he starts to link Regius's views with Descartes.
Oh, so Descartes' name is getting dragged into this.
It is. And Voetius is very clearly suggesting that Descartes is behind all of this, that he's the real intellectual force driving these changes that are threatening his understanding of Calvinist theology.
Okay, so we've got this brewing controversy, and it's getting pretty heated. What does Descartes do? Does he jump in right away and try to defend Regius?
So initially, his involvement is more behind the scenes. He writes to Regius and offers him some advice on how to respond to Voetius.
Okay. What kind of advice?
Well, one thing he suggests is that Regius should try to be a little bit more strategic, a little bit more diplomatic in how he addresses the issue of substantial forms.
Okay.
He basically says, look, you don't need to explicitly refute them. You can just kind of sidestep them. He points to his own example in Meteors, where he just kind of leaves the question of substantial forms hanging. He doesn't really engage with it.
Okay, so that's kind of interesting. He's not saying you're wrong about substantial forms. He's just saying maybe don't pick a fight about it.
Exactly. He's trying to kind of de-escalate the situation. But he also gives Regius some philosophical arguments that he can use against this idea of the mind as a substantial form.
Okay, what are those arguments?
So he basically says, look, if you say that humans think because they have this thinking form, that doesn't really explain anything. It's just a name. It doesn't give you any real insight into how thinking works. He also criticizes the proponents of substantial forms for not being able to clearly define what they are. They often appeal to these occult qualities, these hidden properties, but they don't really give you a clear account of what these forms actually are.
Okay, so he's saying it's kind of a vague and unhelpful concept.
Exactly. And I think the other really interesting point that Descartes makes is that he's concerned that if you start to undermine the idea of substantial forms in the natural world, if you say, look, we don't need substantial forms to explain how plants and animals work,
Right.
well, then that's going to raise questions about the substantial form of the human mind.
So it's like a slippery slope. If you get rid of them for plants and animals, then the mind is next.
Exactly. And Descartes is very concerned to safeguard the spirituality of the mind. So he sees this attack on substantial forms as potentially dangerous.
Okay, so he's giving Regius these kind of strategic and philosophical points to make.
Right.
What does Regius do with them?
So Regius takes Descartes' advice, and he publishes a reply to Voetius in February 1642.
Okay.
And it's called Responsio, Bonsive Nota in Appendicum. So basically a response or notes on the appendix. And he incorporates some of the arguments that Descartes suggested to him.
Okay, so he's trying to be a bit more diplomatic, but he's also putting forward some of these Cartesian arguments.
Right. But unfortunately, this doesn't really help to calm the situation.
Yeah.
In fact, things get even worse.
Really? How so?
So the very next month, in March 1642, the University of Utrecht takes a very drastic step. They forbid Regius from teaching natural philosophy altogether.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, publicly or privately.
So he can't teach his own students about this stuff anymore?
Right, he's basically restricted to just teaching traditional medicine.
Wow, so they're really clamping down.
They are, and they don't stop there. The Academic Senate, with the approval of the town council, they issue an official condemnation of Cartesian philosophy.
It's like they're trying to stamp it out.
Exactly.
Okay, so things are escalating rapidly. At this point, does Descartes decide to get involved more publicly?
He does. And so in the second edition of his Meditations, which comes out in 1642, he includes a letter to Father Dinet.
Okay.
Now, this letter doesn't explicitly mention Voetius by name, but it's very clearly directed at him. And it's clearly a defense of Descartes' philosophy against the kinds of charges that Voetius has been making.
Okay, so he's entering the fray a bit more directly.
He is. And then the following year, in 1643, he publishes Epistola ad Voetium.
Letter to Voetius.
Exactly.
Okay, so now he's really naming names. He's going right at him.
He is.
Yeah.
And this leads to a very complex series of back and forths. There's a lot of back and forth in terms of letters. There are also these official pronouncements from the university. They even set up a committee of inquiry to investigate the whole controversy.
Wow. So it's this big public institutional battle.
It really is. And one of the things that happens is that Martinus Scook, who was a supporter of Voetius, he writes a book in 1643.
Okay.
And he gives it this kind of ironic title, Admiranda Methodus.
The admirable method.
Yeah.
Okay.
But it's a very critical attack on Descartes.
Okay, so what is he saying?
He's accusing Descartes of being an atheist and a skeptic. He's basically saying this guy's a heretic.
Oh, wow.
And he's implying that he should be subject to the same kind of censure that people who were convicted of heresy were subject to.
That's pretty serious.
It is, very serious. And Descartes actually responds to this with a legal action. He accuses Scook of defamation.
Oh, wow.
And this leads to a whole other set of legal wranglings.
So this whole thing has blown up. I mean, it's gone way beyond a philosophical debate. It's a public controversy. It's a legal battle.
It is.
And in the midst of all of this, you would think that Descartes and Regius are like, standing shoulder to shoulder.
You'd think so.
But that's not actually what happens, right? There's this big break between them.
There is. And this is, I think, a really crucial turning point in the story. So despite their initial shared opposition to scholasticism, the Utrecht controversy actually ends up driving a wedge between Descartes and Regius.
Okay.
And part of what's going on here is that Regius's own intellectual interests, especially his interest in medicine and physiology, are pushing him in a slightly different direction than Descartes.
Okay.
And so in July 1645, Regius writes this letter to Descartes.
Okay.
And it's a very critical letter. He's basically expressing concerns about rumors that Descartes has been spreading, rumors that he's got these secret views about the mind and God that are different from what he's published.
So he's saying, hey, I'm hearing things about you.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And he even goes so far as to say that Descartes has actually damaged his own philosophical project by publishing the Meditations.
Ah, that's gotta hurt.
Yeah, so, Descartes is already under attack from Voetius and Scook, and now one of his closest followers is basically echoing some of those same criticisms.
Ouch.
Yeah, it's not a good situation.
Okay, and then to make matters even worse, Regius goes ahead and publishes his own book.
He does. So in 1646, he publishes Fundamenta Physicis.
And I think Descartes wasn't too happy about that.
No, he was not happy at all. He had actually advised Regius not to publish it.
Okay, so what was so controversial about this book?
Well, in it, Regius explicitly rejects several of Descartes' core metaphysical theses.
Oh, so he's really breaking away from him now.
He is. And Descartes is, understandably upset about this.
Yeah, I mean, he's being attacked from all sides.
Right.
Okay, so what does Descartes do?
So he publicly denounces Regius in the preface to the French edition of his Principles of Philosophy, which comes out in 1647.
Okay, so he's really trying to distance himself from Regius and these heterodox views.
Exactly. He's saying, look, this guy doesn't represent me. He's misrepresenting my philosophy.
Okay, and Regius, never want to back down from an intellectual debate. He decides to respond to this.
He does. So he plans to append 21 corollaries to a medical disputation that's scheduled for October 1647.
Okay.
And these corollaries, they include some of the more controversial claims about the mind and about God that he had initially omitted from the published version of Fundamenta Physicis.
Okay, so he's like doubling down on his disagreements with Descartes.
He is.
Well, what happens with the disputation? Does it actually take place?
No, it's actually banned by the rector of the university.
Oh, so they're trying to shut down the debate.
They are.
But Regius, he's not going to let that stop him.
No, he's already circulated copies of the text, so these corollaries are out there.
So the debate continues, even though the university's trying to shut it down.
Exactly. And Descartes responds to this with a piece called Nota in Programma Quodam in 1648.
Notes on a certain program.
Exactly.
Okay. And then Regius replies to that with Brevis Explicatio Mentis Humanae, also in 1648, which is
a brief explanation of the human mind. And it's basically an expanded version of the corollaria that he had appended to the disputation.
Okay, so we've got this back and forth, and really, at the heart of this disagreement is the nature of the human being, right?
Right. They're fundamentally disagreeing about the mind and its relationship to the body. And this disagreement had actually been brewing for some time.
Yeah, it even goes back to some of Regius's comments on a draft of the Meditations.
Exactly. So as early as 1640, we see some of these tensions emerging. And then they become much more pronounced in 1641 with this whole debate about the mind being accidentally united to the body.
Right.
And then when Descartes reviews a draft of Fundamenta Physicis in 1545, he gets really worried.
Okay, why?
Because he feels like Regius has swung too far in the opposite direction. Instead of saying the mind is accidentally united to the body, he seems to be suggesting that they're so intimately connected that the mind is just a mode of the body.
A mode.
Just a property or modification of the body. And Descartes thinks that this is actually even worse than the idea of an accidental union.
Really?
Why? Because it seems to undermine the distinctness of the mind. It seems to imply that the mind is just a material thing.
Okay, so we've got this fundamental disagreement about how to understand the relationship between the mind and the body.
Right. And this is really what drives the final break between them. After 1648, they pretty much stop engaging with each other directly, at least in writing.
Okay, so we've seen how Regius's thought kind of develops in parallel to Descartes, but then diverges in some pretty significant ways. So let's talk about some of those specific points of divergence.
Okay.
Let's start with his epistemology, his theory of knowledge, because it seems like he moves towards a much more empiricist position than Descartes.
Right, so after breaking with Descartes, Regius really develops his own distinct epistemology, and it reflects his background in medicine and physiology.
Okay.
What he ultimately arrives at is an epistemology that looks a lot more like John Locke, who comes later, than like anything you'd find in Descartes.
So he's really anticipating some of those later empiricist ideas.
He is. And this shift actually starts in Fundamenta Physicis, where he explicitly denies the existence of innate ideas.
So he's saying we're not born with these pre-programmed ideas in our minds.
Exactly. He even denies the innate idea of God, which was a very important concept for Descartes.
Right.
And he makes this really interesting statement where he says, the mind, in order to think, does not seem to need innate ideas, images, notions, or axioms. Rather, its innate faculty of thinking is sufficient on its own.
Okay, so we just have this capacity for thinking, but the content of our thought comes from experience.
Exactly. And he uses examples like pain, color, and taste to illustrate this point. He says, look, we experience these things directly. We don't need some innate idea of them.
Okay, that makes sense. So if I've never tasted chocolate, I don't have some innate idea of what chocolate tastes like.
Right.
I have to actually experience it to know what it's like.
Exactly.
So he's rejecting this Cartesian notion of innate ideas, and he actually gives a pretty interesting argument against them.
He does. He says, look, if you ask an uneducated young person about something they haven't experienced, they'll deny having any knowledge of it.
Okay, so he's using this kind of empirical observation to support his claim.
He is. And he explicitly challenges Descartes' view that we have an innate idea of God.
Okay, so how does he think we get the idea of God then?
He says that the idea of God is either produced in us through our observation of the world, or it's passed on to us by others.
Okay, so it's acquired through experience or through learning.
Exactly.
And for Regius, this whole notion of innate ideas is just unnecessary.
Right. It's kind of like Descartes himself had argued against the scholastic entities. He was saying, look, we don't need these extra things to explain how the world works.
Right.
And Regius is making a similar point about innate ideas. He's saying, look, we don't need them to explain how thinking works.
Okay, so he's trying to simplify things, get rid of these unnecessary metaphysical baggage.
Exactly. He even goes so far as to say that sensory stimulation, like when we see light or hear a sound, doesn't require any special kind of, intentional species or spiritual qualities.
Okay.
All it requires is local motion, the movement of particles.
So he's really trying to ground knowledge in a very materialist, mechanistic understanding of the world.
He is.
So how does Descartes respond to this?
So in his Note, Descartes tries to downplay the disagreement. He sort of suggests that maybe it's just a verbal misunderstanding.
Okay.
He says, look, when I talk about innate ideas, I'm really just talking about the mind's innate faculty of thinking.
So he's saying we're not really that far apart.
Right. But Regius is not convinced.
Okay.
And in his later work, Philosophia Naturalis, which comes out in 1654, he doubles down on his empiricist claim. He says that all thoughts, except for those that come from divine revelation, originate in sensory experience.
So that's a pretty strong statement of empiricism.
It is. He's
Yeah.
basically saying we can't think about anything unless we've had some kind of sensory experience of it, either directly or indirectly.
Okay, so that's a pretty significant departure from Descartes. And this emphasis on sensory experience, it also shows up in his rejection of a pure intellect.
Right. So Regius constantly emphasizes the organic connection between the mind and the body.
Okay.
And when he talks about organic, what he really means is bodily dependent.
Okay.
So he's saying that the mind can only perform its various mental functions if the relevant bodily parts are working correctly.
So it's not this separate immaterial substance that can just think on its own?
Exactly. And while he's a little bit more cautious about explicitly denying the existence of a pure understanding in his early work, maybe because of Descartes' advice to avoid direct confrontations with traditional views,
Right.
Descartes himself interprets Regius as implicitly denying it.
So even Descartes is reading him as saying, look, there's no pure intellect.
Right. And later on, Regius confirms this interpretation. He says quite clearly that the human mind is organic in all its actions while it's in the body, and that it can't do anything without the body.
Okay, so he's really tying the mind to the body.
He is. And by 1654, he explicitly denies the need for or the existence of a pure intellect.
Wow. And this has some pretty big implications for how he thinks about our knowledge of God, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Because if all of our ideas originate in sensory experience, and if the intellect is fundamentally dependent on the body, then our idea of God, just like any other idea, has to be acquired through this embodied intellect.
So we don't have some special faculty that it just gives us access to God.
Right.
It all has to come through our senses and our embodied minds.
Exactly.
But this raises a problem, doesn't it? I mean, we have all sorts of ideas of things that don't actually exist. We imagine things, we dream things,
Right.
and sometimes it's hard to tell the difference between our perceptions of real things and our imaginings.
Yeah, so Regius recognizes this. He acknowledges that we frequently have ideas of imaginary realities.
Okay.
And he points out that the subjective experiences that we have in both veridical and non-veridical perceptions can be very similar.
Yeah.
So how do we know what's real?
Right. That's the big question.
It is. And unlike Descartes, who tries to provide this rational defense of the reliability of our cognitive faculties.
You know, he appeals to the goodness of God.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Regius says, look, ultimately, we have to rely on Scripture.
Okay, so he's appealing to religious authority to guarantee the reliability of our senses.
He is. But he also acknowledges that even Scripture doesn't guarantee the absolute certainty of all of our perceptions.
Okay, so there's still some room for error.
Right. And he's particularly concerned about this when it comes to those things that are inherently unobservable, like the tiny particles that he thinks make up all physical bodies.
Oh, okay. So how does he think we can gain knowledge about these unobservable things if our senses are not always reliable?
So he says, look, we have to form hypotheses. And he draws on Descartes' own work in Le Monde, where Descartes presents this kind of, hypothetical account of the universe.
Right. He describes it as a fable.
Exactly. And Regius says, okay, we could use this hypothetical method to try to explain the observable world in terms of these underlying unobservable particles.
Okay.
But the key point is that he recognizes that scientific knowledge that's gained in this way is inherently probabilistic.
Okay, so it's not about absolute certainty.
No, it's about degrees of likelihood. So if we come up with a plausible explanation for something, and we can't think of a better explanation,
Right.
then we should accept that explanation provisionally until a better one comes along.
Okay, so it's always open to revision.
Exactly.
And this is a really significant departure from the Aristotelian ideal of knowledge.
It is,
Huh.
because Aristotle is all about achieving absolute, certain knowledge through intuition and deduction.
Right.
But Regius is saying, look, in the natural world, we can't have that kind of certainty.
Okay, and he's fine with that.
He is. He explicitly says that the only kind of certainty we can have about things outside of our own minds is what he calls moral or probable and likely certainty.
Okay.
And he says, this is enough for us to get by in life. This is enough to guide our actions.
It was a very pragmatic view of knowledge.
It is.
Yeah.
And it's quite forward-thinking for his time.
Okay, so we've talked about his epistemology. Let's move on to his theory of human nature.
Okay.
Because we know that he was initially skeptical of this traditional view of the soul as a substantial form.
Right. He was very much aligned with Descartes in rejecting that Aristotelian view.
Okay.
They both saw it as conceptually opaque and really not helpful in trying to understand how the world works.
Okay.
And when he was writing Fundamental Physics, he actually included a lot of criticisms of the substantial form view of the soul.
Right.
But, as we've discussed, Descartes convinced him to remove some of those criticisms from the published version.
Okay.
But they resurfaced later in the Corollaria and in his later work, Philosophia Naturalis.
Okay, so he's not afraid to eventually come out and say what he really thinks.
No, he's not.
Okay, so what is his view of the relationship between the mind and the body?
Right. So initially, he seems to be on board with Descartes' definition of material substance as extension.
Okay.
And he actually goes even further than Descartes in rejecting any distinction between a material substance and its extension.
Okay.
So he says, look, there's no need to imagine that there's some kind of substance that underlies extension. Extension is just what it is. It can exist on its own.
So he's really emphasizing the reality and independence of matter.
He is.
But if he's following this line of reasoning, then that has implications for thinking too, right?
Right. Because if material substance just is extension, then thinking as an attribute wouldn't need a distinct substance in which to inhere.
Okay, so is he saying that thinking is just a property of matter?
He doesn't quite come.